Our next speaker, unfortunately, is also unwell and can't come today. Wendy Raschke of the University of California, Riverside. But she has sent a paper and a PowerPoint, and her husband, who happens to be here, and you may also have heard of, Thomas Scanlon, is going to read it on her behalf. Thank you, Tom.
All right, thank you. Sorry for the glitch in the organization, and she very much regrets not being able to make it to the actual event. Yeah, we're set up there. Okay. So this is Athletics, Cult, and the Coming of Christianity at Olympia. In the sanctuary at Olympia, the Temple of Zeus was built between 470 and 457 BC. It stood as an elegant testimony to classical architecture and to the spirit of the games until well into the imperial period, but suffered a fire during the reign of Theodosius II, 408 to 450 CE. The extent of this fire seems to have been exaggerated by the scholiast on Lucian, who claims that the temple was burned down, that its destruction resulted in the end of the games. Clearly, the quantity of material unearthed, including decorative metopes and pedimental sculpture, suggests that much of the temple survived in what could have been only in a small fire. One of the German excavators of Olympia, Ulrich Sinn, has evidence for pagan cults in the temple up to the 5th century, and he believes that the pagan temple stood relatively complete until the end of that period. He envisages the temple as continuing to stand within the site of the Christian church, but he is now ensconced by fortress-like walls, not built in the 3rd century, as had been argued, that is part of the early Byzantine settlement. The Temple of Zeus also contained Phidias's immense Chryselephantine statue of the god, conceived in the nearby workshop of Phidias. The workshop lies southwest of the Temple of Zeus, as you probably know, outside the Temenus wall. When first excavated, it was beneath the Byzantine church and first designated as Building A, until the appearance of a considerable amount of sculptural material inside and in proximity to it sealed the identification of the workshop described in Pausanias. Why the Christian community chose this workshop as the site of their church rather than the Temple of Zeus itself is unclear. Certainly, the basic form of the workshop is similar to that of the Cella of the Temple of Zeus. Perhaps the smaller building was adequate for the community's needs, but further investigation is warranted. Much discussion has taken place regarding the Christian reuse of pagan buildings. Some believe that Christians found here an opportunity for a political statement, a proclamation of the superiority of Christianity over paganism. This can be illustrated by the treatment of major buildings in Athens, including the mutilation of key figures in the frieze of the Parthenon. Others assure us that often the buildings taken over have been subject to prior destruction or decay, and that the Christians did not deliberately demolish them. It was simply practical for them to reuse them or their materials. Moreover, it is suggested that the decline of paganism would have preceded Christianization, though the envisaged confrontation between religions did not take place. A more cautious approach recommends that we investigate the possibility of the survival for specific reasons and in specific historical settings, suggesting that it was a complex phenomenon involving the monument's overall significance, the action taken against it, and the literary discourse surrounding it. Evidence from Rome and from the empire point to uneven enforcement of the anti-pagan legislation of the Christian emperors, at least until 391 CE. Clearly, concepts of sacred space varied widely between Christians and pagans, and sacred pagan buildings often occupied a poor position in the city compared to Christian churches. This perhaps surprising situation has been attributed to the fact that pagan cult and ceremonial activities were ensconced within the walls of the city, whereas those of the Christians tended to be outside. But perhaps this was simply more coincidental with priority, the fact that the pagans were there first. It is commonly held that churches completed within the traditional pagan temples, and hence the assertion of Christian takeovers. But there were two interests, where the two interests were located in separate spheres, the priority to do away with the older form was substantially lessened. In any case, it appears that the Christian churches and pagan temples alike were, by the late 4th century AD, regarded as public buildings. This may be illustrated by the Porticus Deorum Concentium in the Roman Forum. It was restored by the Praetextatus, the city prefect of 367, who saw it not as a pagan monument in need of repair, but as an emblem of universal deity essential for the preservation of the city. Let us now consider some specific instances of Pan-Hellenic sites as groundwork for Olympia. No, that's okay. At Delphi, some form of athletic games appear to have continued at least until the 5th century AD. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that the stadium and the gymnasium were maintained clear of debris until that time. The games were still operative in 424 when we hear of a complaint from the citizen of Delphi against a liturgy repayment for the games in Constantinople, because they have no more funds beyond those they need for their own games. Shortly thereafter, however, and until the same century, the entrance to the stadium was narrowed to facilitate its use for pasturing cattle. 3 Christian churches were built in the 6th century at Delphi. One was located above the Palaestra, and as it was in medieval times known as the Agios Georgios. Pausanias describes the approach to what we now consider the quote. Here's our quote. As you come into the city, is a series of temples. The first was in ruins, the next empty of statues, the third had a few portraits of Roman kings, and the fourth is called the Temple of Foresight, Athena Pronoia. If Pausanias had visited Delphi years later in the 6th century, he probably would have found in this location a monumental Christian basilica, which has almost entirely disappeared today. 2 other churches were established at Delphi, one west of the sanctuary in the cemetery of the modern village. The second, which suffered from later vandalism, was located on the entrance on the terrace above the Temple of Apollo, and this is the only one within the temenos. The Temple of Apollo itself was not demolished to accommodate any church, nor indeed did it undergo conversion into one. When it suffered a fire sometime after the 3rd century, it was repaired, possibly by the Emperor Julian. At Delphi, then, there appears to have been continuing respect for ancient pagan monuments, at least during the period up to the 5th century AD. After the 6th century, there were churches at every entrance to the sanctuary at Delphi. Okay, sorry, I skipped the slide here. You see the Athena Pronoia in the bottom right area there. Okay. Now I believe we are moving to Nemea. Like Olympia, Nemea was a sanctuary of Zeus. Beginning in 573 BCE, athletic games took place there as a part of the Periodos, or 4 Stephanitic games. The site of the Nemean games shifted from Nemea itself to Argos by 271 BC. But Nemea remained important as a sanctuary to Zeus until at least the 2nd century AD. It was generally advocated that the end of the games came with the Edict of Theodosius I in 393. More recent discussion is based on the evidence of a letter on behalf of the Argives from the 4th century AD, pleading that they be released from their financial contribution to Nemea because they had to support their own games and were suffering financial difficulties at that time. The letter is the latest evidence we have for the games, and it indicates a date in the mid-4th century. An older view, which asserts the use of the stadium into the 5th century, has now been relinquished. Excavation in the area has unearthed early Christian farming trenches in the western slope of the stadium's embankment, north of the entrance tunnel, and the site was likely given over to agriculture by the 4th century. The builders of the early Christian basilica in the late 5th century AD appear to have plundered the Temple of Zeus. Some 1,120 masonry stones have been identified as from that source. Certainly, all the Corinthian columns in the basilica formerly belonged to the temple's interior order. The basilica was built on the site of the Xenon, or guest house for athletes at Nemea. But it is important to remember that the temple was by this time in a state of disrepair. By the 2nd century AD, the roof had fallen in and the cult statue was gone. While the main structure has remained standing, the interior Corinthian columns stood exposed for some considerable time. They ultimately collapsed when the stylobate was cut, probably in the 5th century AD, long after the end of the games. Despite the transfer of the games to Argos and the decline of the Nemean site itself before the establishment of the basilica, Nemea occupied an important place in the memory of Greeks in late antiquity as the site of Heracles' first labor, and an original site of the Pan-Hellenic Games to Zeus. The basilica did not occupy the space of the temple or the stadium. They were left as memorials to the athletic and mythical achievements of an earlier era. At Olympia, the early Christian basilica of the mid-5th century date was built directly into the workshop of Phidias, sculptor of the cult statue of Zeus, which became a focal point for visitors to the games and one of the wonders of the ancient world. As at Delphi and Nemea, the basilica is not built on top of the temple itself, but was placed to one side. Indeed, here outside the sanctuary proper, it was placed. Left intact were the stadium, the baths, and the gymnasium, the core of the contest facilities, almost as if a gesture of respect both to the sacred pagan site and to its Olympic Games. Why the basilica was placed in the artist's workshop prompts speculation. It's a building of moderate size and the same fundamental plan as the Zeus temple. It has the same east-west orientation. Metaphorically, the Christian site directly follows in the footprint of the Temple of Zeus, and the new inhabitants may, as elsewhere, have wished to preserve the mythical imagery related to the games. At Olympia, of course, Heracles is viewed as one alternative to Pelops as the founder of the Olympic Games. The traditional stories attached to each are represented on the Temple of Zeus. Pelops in the east pediment, preparing for a chariot race against Oenomaus for the hand of his daughter, and with it the kingdom of Elis. Pelops, by fair means or foul, depending on the tradition you follow, wins the race and takes the prize. Heracles, of course, appears in the sculpted metopes, where most of his 12 canonical labors are represented. These labors symbolize the struggles of the athletes participating in the Olympic competition. The term athla is used for both contests and labors, and according to the poet Pindar, Heracles was not a particularly big man. This is perhaps also indicated in the Hesperides metope by his need for a cushion to reach and support the universe. Gellius, however, who cites Plutarch as his source, relates that Pythagoras had a different view. He rationalized that Heracles was tall on the basis of the tradition, and that the stadium at Olympia was measured out by 600 times his feet and is longer than any other stadia, supposedly the same length. In sum, Heracles was closely associated with the sacred spaces of the stadium and the sanctuary proper. In the late Archaic period, Heracles was a preeminent hero. During the second half of the 6th century BC, he was the personal and public hero of the tyrant Pisistratus, and consequently, he's very visible on Greek vases and architectural schemes of that period. wrong, and is known for his endurance, courage, and compassion, not to mention his appetites. That he became an enduring image of athleticism is understandable, and he remains so even in the modern era. In later antiquity, Heracles' continuing popularity with athletes can be illustrated in several ways. For example, a guild hall was established on the Oppian Hill in Rome by the mid-2nd century, close to the Amphitheatrum Flavium, that is the Colosseum, and the baths of Trajan and Titus. It was the headquarters for local guilds, styling itself the Sacred Zistic Association of those connected with Heracles. According to the epigraphic evidence from the site, the recent identification of a comparable guild building for athletes at Olympia has led one scholar, Ulrich Sinn, to posit a new phase of veneration of Heracles in the late 1st century CE. He sees proof that cult and competitions were going on as late as 385. The very physical rather than spiritual image associated with Heracles would seem at first to make him an unlikely candidate for appropriation by Christian iconography. He in fact provides an acute analogy for Christ. He was the son of the supreme god Zeus and a mortal woman, Alcmene, and as Christ was the offspring of a god and a mortal woman. He was not infrequently worshipped as Alexikakos, defender against evil, and is often the case with heroes. He was believed to have healing powers. Accordingly, we find him associated with the cult of Asclepius at Epidaurus. It has been suggested that the story of the Lernaean Hydra is rooted in the draining of a swamp. The scholiasts Lactantius and Servius are clear on that point. Swamps were known to be a source of plague, and if Heracles did provide relief for the community around Argos, it would not be surprising that he became a symbol of the eradication of plagues and epidemics and a source of healing. Heracles performed a variety of labors against his will, of course, with a success that verges on the miraculous. He descended into Hades to capture the dog Cerberus and achieved what a few mortals can achieve by returning to the upper world. Such a feat has obvious resonances with Christ's death and resurrection. Ultimately, he was received into Mount Olympus, the Greek equivalent of heaven. It has recently been argued that a, quote, Christ-curious Greek at a house church meeting responding to a reading of Revelations 4-6 with its description of one upon the throne and the Lamb who was slain might draw an analogy with Heracles' depiction on and around the throne of Phidias' Zeus at Olympia. That once an association between these two has been made in the new convert's mind, it would be most difficult to dislodge. The parallels which the Greek hero provides with the Christ figure are and have been easily appreciated. One remarkable example is of the Christian acceptance of Heracles is provided by the catacombs of the Via Latina in Rome. Here are contained 13 rooms with fresco decorations, many of them bearing Christian and Old Testament cycles of paintings. But 2 of the rooms contain imagery which is exclusively pagan. Cleopatra, possibly as a double for Tellus or / Italy, is visible here. But more importantly for the present discussion, in room N appears the labors of Heracles. That's this one. This is the one. Elsner comments that it, quote, attests to nothing less than a salvific allegory in which a pagan savior god, Hercules, not only triumphs over several monsters, but also rescues the soul of Alcestis, and in the process conquers the hound of hell, conquering death itself, end quote. Elsner's interest as an art historian is in the interpretive possibilities of the juxtaposition of Christian and pagan images. I suggest that this kind of juxtaposition may also furnish some rationale for the acceptance of the coexistence of pagan and Christian places of worship in some contexts. We may consider one further illustration On the island of Paros, the most famous Christian structure is the Petopoliani Basilica in the city of Parikia. The core of the basilica goes back to the 4th century, and the archaeologists have determined that the structure incorporated many architectural members from pre-Christian buildings, notably the parts of a gymnasium structure of the Middle Imperial period. The presence of a gymnasium here is also attested by inscriptions indicating festival games on Paros, which went back at least to the 2nd century BC. The best speculation is that the church itself was built on or next to the ancient gymnasium. Most interesting is the discovery preserved on the floor of the 4th century AD Basilica of the Baptistry of a large mosaic depicting the labors of Heracles. Sort of hard to see here, but it's Heracles in the Cernaean hind there on the right, and on the top is the Nemean lion partially revealed, and the boar being put into a pot. So these mosaics with Heracles, it would have been these, by the way, these were inside the basilica and were moved outside into the blazing sunlight. We were in Paris recently. It would have been on view to the Christians in the baptistry, though some commentators assert that it may have been part of a Roman villa. The most plausible scholarly view is that it was part of the floor of the gymnasium. If so, in the Parikia baptistry, as at Olympia, Heracles stood as a pertinent image, resonating both with Christians and with the athletically oriented populace of ancient Paros. We now return to my original question. The workshop of Phidias lies just west of the Temple of Zeus, but it is outside the Altus wall. In the centuries between the time of Phidias and the 5th century AD, it was used for various purposes. Pausanias speaks of it as a pantheon in the 2nd century. Thereafter, evidence indicates its continuing use, perhaps as a type of shed or one of several workshops for manual laborers on the site. Here in the 5th century, the Christians elected to build their church, lining the walls with marble slabs from nearby buildings. They constructed an apse in the east end and a new entrance on the west side. At this time, the Temple of Zeus was still extant and surrounded by a wall, which could be construed as a testimony to the value placed upon the temple and the surrounding statuary by its new inhabitants. It may have also been in response to the imperial legislation concerned with protecting ancient buildings from spoliation. Why then did the Christians at Olympia elect to build their basilica out of the workshop of Phidias, rejecting the far more splendid Temple of Zeus? Was it to be in direct competition with the pagan building, as has been suggested? As we have seen, both are in an east-west axis and so equally appropriate. Or was it because the smaller building better fitted the needs of a clearly smaller community? Furthermore, a number of later workshops have been identified in the area. Perhaps the association of Phidias's workshop with manual labor appealed to the Christian craftsmen. Yet the trappings of Phidias's activity, namely the majority of molds used for cult statues, had already been disposed of in a trench to the south in the period 430 to 410 BC, soon after the completion of the Zeus statue in the Temple of Zeus. Or was the Temple of Zeus avoided because the new settlers preferred not to destroy a building meaningful, not only for the games, but also because of the images on it? Though the pediments clearly reflect the foundation myths of Olympia and the idea of competition, the metapiece portray the labors of Heracles. In him, a Christian might see here, as elsewhere, a man confronting and surviving the struggles of life, a man who is capable of miracles with divine support, and, as Alexei Kakos, of providing salvation in some form, a man who is actually the son of a god and who will rejoin his father eventually in heaven. In conclusion, we can observe how the image of Heracles most strikingly was preserved and possibly exploited by the early Christians, clearly at Olympia, possibly at Nemea, allowing converts to make at least a partial assimilation between the figures of the two divine sons, Christ and Heracles. Heracles was also figures in the mythology of Delphi, but as a hero angry with the oracle and one who wrestles with Apollo to steal the tripod with a view to creating an alternative religious center. All the Pan-Hellenic sites, especially Isthmia, witnessed the building of a Christian, except Isthmia, witnessed the building of a Christian basilica in the late antiquity and demonstrate the Christian structures sought not aggressively to occupy the sites of those most famous festivals. Rather, they wanted to establish a presence that acknowledged the public's interest in contests, while offering sympathetic but very different alternative Christian worship, namely to be a, quote, athlete for Christ, a metaphor first employed by St. Paul at Corinth. Incredibly, testimony to Paul's association with the athletic image still exists beyond literature. The Cleveland Museum of Art owns a silver spoon, which depicts St. Paul as an athlete. It's hard to see him here, but he's here crowning himself as an athlete, and belongs to the period 350 to 400 AD. The provenance is uncertain, but it may be from Syria. And that's the end. Thank you very much. And Wendy's